It was a June evening in Madrid, and the sky over the Plaza de Lima had gone deep violet. Across the plaza and stretching into the wide avenues that fan out toward the Santiago Bernabeu, more than 600,000 young people stood pressed together, some holding candles, some wiping tears from their faces before the vigil had even begun. They had come from every corner of Spain and from dozens of countries beyond. Many of them having traveled through the night, sleeping in train stations or on chapel floors just to be there. And when the white figure of Pope Leo XIV stepped onto the stage, the crowd broke into something that was not quite cheering and not quite weeping. It was both at once a sound that rose from the chest and could not be contained. If you have never seen 600,000 people cry at the same moment, you cannot understand what Madrid felt like on the night of June 6, 2026. Take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. It means more than you know. The Church had not brought a pope to Madrid in 15 years. The last time was the summer of 2011, when Pope Benedict XVI arrived for the 26th World Youth Day, and that gathering, held at the vast flat expanse of Cuatro Vientos Airport, drew nearly 2 million pilgrims from around the world. It was one of the largest gatherings in modern Catholic history. Benedict stood before that ocean of young faces and spoke of Christ the way a man speaks of someone he has loved for a very long time, with quietness, with depth, with a certainty that does not need to be loud. Many of those who attended said afterward that they never forgot it. 15 years is a long time. The church that gathered on that airport tarmac in 2011 is not the same church that gathered in the Plaza de Lima in 202. A generation has passed. A pandemic reshaped the world. Pope Francis died on April 20, 2025, after more than 12 years as pontiff, and the long shadow of his papacy, its reforming energy, its controversies, its tenderness for the margins, still lay over everything. And on May 8, 2025, the cardinals elected a man few outside Catholic circles had heard of, Robert Francis Prevost, an Augustinian friar from Chicago who had spent decades in Peru, a man who took the name Leo XIV. Less than 13 months after his election, he was standing in the heart of Madrid. The decision to visit Spain for his first extended apostolic journey was not accidental. The Spanish Church has deep roots, deeper than most national churches in the world. It was Spain that sent missionaries to the Americas in the 16th century, that gave the church figures like Saint Ignatius of Loyola and Saint Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross, that endured brutal persecution in the 20th century and emerged, bruised and transformed, into a democracy. Spain is also a country where secularism has advanced rapidly, where mass attendance has dropped sharply in a single generation, and where the church often finds itself speaking to a culture that has largely moved on. The Spanish Episcopal Conference, the gathering of all the bishops of Spain, had invited Leo XIV to come. The Archdiocese of Madrid had prepared for months, and the Pope had said yes. He arrived at Adolfo Suarez Madrid Barajas Airport on the morning of June 6, 2026, greeted by government officials and church leaders. He met with King Felipe VI and Queen Letizia at the Royal Palace. He visited a Caritas social project called Cedia 24 Horas, a shelter and support center for people in situations of extreme poverty, addiction, and abandonment. He knelt there and prayed with them before the cameras, and the crowds even arrived. And then, as the evening came on and the Spanish summer light softened into gold and rose, he made his way to the Plaza de Lima. What the organizers had described as a prayer vigil for young people had grown into something no one had quite anticipated. The estimate from local authorities was more than 600,000 gathered in and around the plaza, spilling through the adjacent streets, gathered in groups on the grass of the Park Juan Carlos I nearby, watching on screens mounted across the city. Many of them were weeping before the Pope had said a single word. Weeping simply because he was there, because the Church was there, because in a world that often felt accelerating towards something none of them could name, here was a moment of stillness. The vigil had been designed to feel intimate despite its scale. The stage was arranged unusually like a living room, chairs placed in a circle, with young people and the Pope speaking to one another directly, rather than from behind a lectern. There was music, and there were testimonies, and there was a period of Marian prayer that flowed into Eucharistic adoration. But it was in the dialogue, the unscripted exchange between Leo XIV and the young people seated around him, that the evening became something that will not be forgotten. A young woman from Seville asked the Pope what he had learned from his years as a missionary in Peru. He did not pause long before answering. He spoke of the people he had known there, not as objects of charity, but as teachers. He said that in the poor neighborhoods of Chulucanas and later Trujillo, in the years he spent as a parish pastor and seminary professor and diocesan administrator, he had watched people face hardship without losing hope, and that this had undone something proud in him, he said. As I proclaimed the gospel, I too was transformed by it. I have seen how the word of God can transform conflict into peace, can be a source of reconciliation, peace, and justice. And the young people listening to him were quiet, the way people are quiet when they understand that what they are hearing is real. He spoke of the saints who had formed his own spiritual imagination. St. John Chrysostom, the 4th century bishop of Constantinople, called the Golden-Mouthed, who preached the gospel so fearlessly that the powerful of his day exiled him twice and still could not silence him. He spoke of St. Thomas of Villanova, the Spanish Augustinian of the 16th century, who gave away his bishop's vestments to the poor and said that the measure of a Christian was what they gave, not what they kept. And he spoke of St. Turribius of Mogrovejo, the Spanish missionary bishop who evangelized Peru in the same 16th century, a man who traveled thousands of miles on foot through the Andes to bring the sacraments to indigenous communities, and who is now the patron saint of the Latin American episcopate. It was not lost on anyone in the crowd that Leo XIV himself had walked something of the same path in Peru, an ocean away in time and method, but spiritually continuous with the work Turribius began. And then a young man from Barcelona asked the Pope what he wanted to say to a generation that felt often that the Church had nothing left to offer them, that it was an institution of the past, locked in disputes the modern world had left behind. Leo XIV looked at him for a moment before answering. He said that the mission he entrusted to them was precisely this, that they be human. He said it with a plainness that made the plaza go quiet. Yes, be human, men and women of flesh and blood, not mere appearances, but trustworthy faces. He said that the greatest temptation of this age was not wickedness, but superficiality, the willingness to become a surface rather than a depth, to perform rather than to inhabit, he warned, and this was the moment that many in the crowd said afterward broke them open. He warned against the risk of Christians allowing themselves to be infected by attitudes marked by worldly ideologies, by political and economic positions that lead to unfair generalizations and misleading conclusions. He said that the Church does not exist to confirm what the world already believes. It exists to call the world towards something it has not yet found. And then he said it, the line that would be carried out of Madrid in millions of hearts. You can change history, do it with love. It was not a campaign slogan. It was not a motivational phrase printed on a poster. In the context of everything that had come before, the saints, the gospel transformed into lives, the warning against superficiality, the call to be fully human, it landed differently than those words usually. Land, the crowd heard it as an inheritance and a commission at the same time. Many of them wept. Some of them sat on the pavement and bowed their heads. Some embraced strangers around them. And the vigil that followed, the Eucharistic adoration that stretched into the warm Madrid night, was held in a silence so deep that the city outside seemed to withdraw. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand what the Church has been living through. Leo XIV took the papal throne in the wake of Francis, whose death on April 21, 2025, had closed one of the most turbulent chapters in the modern papacy. Francis had polarized Catholics, as few popes had done in living memory, loved intensely by those who felt he had opened the Church to the margins, criticized sharply by those who feared he was loosening doctrinal foundations. Leo XIV was not elected as a reaction to Francis. He was elected as a man, a specific formed, tested man, whom the cardinals believed had the capacity to hold a church that had not resolved its tensions, and to lead it forward without pretending the tensions were not real. He was an Augustinian. He had spent his formation not in the curial corridors of Rome, but in the mountains and lowlands of Peru. He was an American who had become Peruvian. He was a canon lawyer who wept in prayer. He was someone who had known poor people, not as a category but as neighbors, friends, people whose names he remembered. And here, in Madrid, the young people saw all of that. The Spanish Episcopal Conference, the bishops of Spain gathered under Cardinal Juan José Omeya of Barcelona, had worked for months to prepare the apostolic journey. On June 8, 2 days after the vigil, Leo XIV would meet with the bishops at the offices of the Episcopal Conference and then address the Spanish Parliament in a joint session of both chambers. The first time in history that a pope had spoken to the Spanish Parliament in that way, something neither John Paul II nor Benedict XVI had done. These were institutional moments of enormous symbolic weight. But the vigil at Plaza de Lima was not institutional. It was something else entirely. The history of the Church's relationship with youth in Spain runs through several painful decades. The post-Franco generation came of age in a church that was deeply entwined with state power and social conservatism. The liberalization of the 1980s and 1990s brought a rapid secularization that was not always matched by a corresponding renewal in the Church's pastoral imagination. World Youth Day in Madrid in 2011 was a genuine counterpoint to that narrative, a demonstration that young Spaniards and young people across the world could gather in enormous numbers around a faith that was not nostalgic or defensive, but alive and seeking. But 2011 was 15 years ago. The question that had haunted the Spanish Church in the years since was whether that gathering had been a peak or a beginning, whether it had left roots or had simply been a beautiful and passing season. The evening of June 6, 2026 was not an answer to that question in any final sense, but it was evidence, and the evidence deserves to be taken seriously. In the years between 2011 and 2026, the numbers told a discouraging story. Roughly half of all Spaniards still identified as Catholic by 2026, but only about 15% were practicing. The number of infants being baptized had fallen below 50% of births, a threshold that, once crossed, tends not to reverse easily. Fewer than 20% of couples were choosing to be married in the church. These were not numbers that could be dismissed or spun. They represented a real and rapid retreat from institutional faith in one of Europe's historically most Catholic nations. And yet at the same time, something else was happening that the numbers did not quite capture. A report published in 2026 by the SM Foundation, a Spanish educational research organization that has tracked generational attitudes toward faith for decades, found that 38.4% of young Spaniards said that religion was quite or very important in their lives. More striking still, the percentage of young people in Spain who identified as Catholic had grown from 31.6% in 2020 to 45% by 2025. In 5 years, the number had risen by more than 13 percentage points. This was not a trend that showed up easily in Sunday Mass counts. It was quieter than that, more private, harder to see. A generation that had grown up without the church discovering, on their own, and without institutional pressure, that the questions the church addresses were real questions, and that the answers it offered were worth taking seriously. This is the context in which 600,000 of them came to the Plaza de Lima. 600,000 young people do not gather in a plaza on a Friday evening because they are told to. They gather because something draws them, something they recognize in themselves even when they cannot name it. A hunger for depth, for meaning, for the sense that their lives are not simply their own private management projects, but part of something larger and older and more demanding. The Church, at its best, has always offered that. Leo XIV, standing in the Plaza de Lima, with the lights of the Bernabeu visible in the distance and the night air warm around him, offered it in the plainest possible terms. Be human and change history with love. There is a particular quality to Leo XIV that those who have watched him closely since his election have tried to describe. He is not a performer. He does not have the theatrical gift of John Paul II, who could fill a stadium not just with his presence, but with a kind of theatrical, spiritual energy that crackled through crowds. He does not have the disarming, informal warmth of Francis, who had a way of making millions of people feel that the Pope had somehow singled them out personally and seen them. Leo XIV is something different. He is, above all, a man who has been formed by long years of unglamorous work in places the Church's center of gravity does not usually consider. He spent years in Chulucanas, a poor Peruvian city far from Lima, helping rebuild communities after floods, working in a seminary, administering canon law in situations that had no easy answers. He learned the language of the people around him. He became, over time, someone those people trusted, not because he performed for them, but because he stayed. When he stood before 600,000 young people in Madrid and told them to be human, it was not an abstraction. He was describing something he had learned by living it. And the young people in the plaza could hear the difference between a man reading words and a man speaking from experience. That is why many of them wept. Not because they were emotionally manipulated, because they recognized something true. Saint Augustine, the patron of the Augustinian order to which Leo XIV belongs, wrote in the 4th century a sentence that has never lost its edge. Our heart is restless until it repose in thee. He wrote it as autobiography, as the account of a man who had searched everywhere for satisfaction and found only more restlessness until he found God. It was written in Latin in North Africa 1500 years before the Plaza de Lima existed. But it is the sentence that was living in the crowd that night, in the young people who had come from Barcelona and Bilbao and Valencia and Buenos Aires and Lagos and Manila and Chicago, who had slept on floors and traveled through the night to be in a plaza in Madrid because something in them was restless and they were hoping maybe to find what they were looking for. And whether they found it that night, or whether it will take years more, or whether the seeds planted in that plaza will bloom in ways that none of us can see from here, that is not something that can be measured by the evening's attendance figures, or the number of tears shed, or the volume of the crowd's response when the Pope spoke. It is measured in the long life of a faith that has been passing from one generation to the next for 2,000 years. What is certain is this: Leo XIV stood before them. He did not perform for them. He spoke to them as a man who had been formed by poverty and prayer, and the slow work of the gospel in places the world largely ignores. He told them that they were capable of changing history. He told them to do it with love. And in the warm June night in Madrid, with 600,000 young Catholics standing in the streets around him, something happened that was worth paying attention to. Be human he told them. Not appearances, trustworthy faces. It was enough to make them weep. And if you are watching this, wherever you are in the world tonight, perhaps you understand why.